I used to surf at dawn near Point Reyes, back when I was living in a trailer just off Highway 1. The place wasn't much a rusted-out airstream I rented for next to nothing from a guy who owned a struggling oyster farm down the road, but it was close to the water, and that was all that mattered to me then. I was working nights at a warehouse in San Rafael, stacking boxes and trying not to think too much about how my life had ended up there, and surfing in the mornings was the only thing that kept me sane. The water's always cold up there, even in summer, and the fog rolls in thick enough that you can barely see the cliffs. Most mornings, I had the beach to myself. Late October that year was colder than usual. The fog came in heavy and stayed late into the day, and the ocean had that gray, metallic look it gets when winter's coming. I'd been surfing that stretch of coast for 3 months by then, and I knew the rhythm of it, the way the swells came in, the rocks you had to watch for, the spots where the rip current could pull you out if you weren't careful. It was a lonely place, but I liked that. I liked the silence. I liked the way the world felt smaller out there, like nothing existed except the cold water and the sound of the waves breaking against the shore. That morning, I woke up around 5:30 and made instant coffee on the little camp stove in the trailer. The fog was thick outside, pressing against the windows, and I could hear the ocean even though I couldn't see it. I pulled on my wetsuit, grabbed my board, and walked the quarter-mile down to the beach. The sand was wet and heavy, and my footprints filled with water as I walked. There was one other car in the lot, an old pickup truck I'd seen a few times before, but I didn't see the guy who owned it. He was probably already out in the water. I paddled out just as the sun was starting to burn through the mist, the sky turning from black to gray to a pale, washed-out blue. The water was freezing, even through the wetsuit, and my hands went numb almost immediately. I sat on my board, waiting for a good set, watching the fog shift and curl around me. The visibility was bad, maybe 30, 40 feet at most. I could hear the waves breaking to my left, but I couldn't see the shore. It was like being suspended in nothing, just me and the cold water and the sound of my own breathing. That's when I saw it. A shape in the fog, massive and dark, moving slowly from north to south. At first, I thought it was a rock formation I hadn't noticed before, or maybe a kelp bed catching the light in a strange way. But as it got closer, I realized it was a ship, a massive ship, old-fashioned, with tall masts and tattered sails that hung limp in the still air. It was drifting silent through the fog about 100 yards offshore, moving at a steady, deliberate pace that didn't match the current or the wind. There was no motor sound, no lights, just this impossibly large vessel gliding through water too shallow for anything that size. I froze on my board, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The ship was enormous, bigger than any boat I'd ever seen in person, and it looked old, not antique, but old in a way that felt wrong, like it had been at sea for far too long. The wood of the hull was dark and weathered, almost black in places, and the sails were torn and patched with fabric that didn't match. I couldn't see a name on the side, no markings or flags, nothing to identify where it had come from or where it was going. It just drifted, silent and still, cutting through the fog like it was part of it. I don't know how long I sat there, watching it pass. It felt like a long time, but it might have only been a minute or two. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Ships that size don't come into water this shallow. The depth here is maybe 30, 40 feet at most, and a vessel like that would need twice that just to stay afloat. And there was no sound, no engine, no crew calling out, no splash of water against the hull. Just silence, thick and heavy, like the fog itself was swallowing every noise. As the ship passed, I could swear I saw figures moving on the deck. Shadows, darker than the fog around them, shifting and pacing in slow, deliberate movements. They didn't move like living people. There was something off about the way they walked, something too smooth, too fluid, like they were gliding rather than stepping. I couldn't make out any details, no faces, no clothes, just shapes that moved and then stopped, standing still as statues before moving again. I wanted to call out, to shout and see if anyone would answer, but my throat had closed up and I couldn't make a sound. The whole thing lasted maybe 2 minutes before the fog swallowed it completely. One moment it was there, solid and real, and the next it was gone, disappearing into the mist like it had never existed at all. I sat there, shaking, my hands gripping the sides of my board so hard my knuckles hurt. The water around me was calm, undisturbed, like nothing had passed through it. I could still hear the waves breaking on the shore, the same rhythm as before, and the fog was already starting to thin as the sun climbed higher. I paddled back to shore as fast as I could, my arms burning with the effort, and when I reached the beach, I stumbled onto the sand, my legs weak and unsteady. The only other guy on the beach was there, standing near the waterline with his board under his arm. He was older, maybe 50, with a gray beard and a wetsuit that had seen better days. I'd seen him a few times before, always surfing alone, and we'd never spoken beyond a nod or a wave. I walked up to him, trying to catch my breath, and asked if he'd seen it. He looked at me, his face blank, and said, "Seen what?" I pointed out at the water, toward where the ship had been, and told him. A massive ship, old-fashioned, with sails and masts, drifting through the fog. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he shook his head. "There's no ship out there, man," he said. His voice was flat, almost dismissive, like he thought I was messing with him or maybe losing my mind. "I've been out there for an hour. There's nothing." I opened my mouth to argue, to insist that I knew what I'd seen, but the look on his face stopped me. He wasn't lying. He genuinely hadn't seen it, and that scared me more than anything else. I nodded, mumbled something about the fog playing tricks, and walked back to my trailer, my board dragging in the sand behind me. For the rest of that day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told myself it had to be a hallucination, maybe hypothermia from the cold water, or exhaustion from too many nights working and not enough sleep. But I didn't believe that. I knew what I'd seen. It was real. The ship, the sails, the figures on the deck, all of it was real. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the trailer, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the metal walls. Around midnight, I gave up and pulled out my phone, searching for anything I could find about ships near Point Reyes. And that's when I found the stories. Lots of them. Forums, blog posts, old newspaper articles scanned and uploaded to archives. Stories about ghost ships off the California coast, vessels that appear in the fog and vanish without a trace. Some of the accounts went back 100 years or more. Sailors reporting massive ships drifting through the mist, always silent, always moving against the wind or the current. Some of the ships had names, old wrecks that had gone down decades or centuries ago. Others were unidentified, just described as dark, ancient vessels with torn sails and no crew. One story stuck with me. It was from the 1920s, written by a fisherman who'd been working near Drake's Bay, just south of where I'd been surfing. He described seeing a ship in the fog, a tall-masted schooner with black sails, drifting through water too shallow for it to pass. He said he saw figures on the deck, shadows that moved but didn't seem alive, and when he tried to approach, the ship vanished. He never went back to that part of the coast, and he wrote that he'd spoken to other fishermen who'd seen the same thing. They all said the same thing: the ship was real, but it wasn't from this world. I read those stories until my phone battery died, and then I sat in the dark, trying to convince myself that it was all just folklore, ghost stories told by people who'd spent too much time alone at sea. But I couldn't shake the image of that ship, the way it moved so silently through the fog, the shadows on the deck that didn't move like people. I kept thinking about the figures, the way they'd paced back and forth, slow and deliberate, like they were waiting for something, or looking for something. I didn't go back to that beach for a week. I told myself I was just taking a break, that I needed to catch up on sleep or fix something on my board. But the truth was, I was scared. Scared of what I'd seen, and scared of what I might see if I went back. But eventually, I couldn't stay away. Surfing was the only thing that made sense to me then, the only thing that felt real, and I needed it. When I finally went back, the fog was lighter and the water was clearer. I paddled out, keeping my eyes on the horizon, half expecting to see the ship again. But there was nothing, just the ocean, cold and gray, and the sound of the waves. I surfed for an hour, catching a few decent rides, and by the time I came back to shore, I'd almost convinced myself that it had been a one-time thing, a trick of the fog and the light. But I never felt the same out there after that. Every time the fog rolled in, I'd find myself watching the water, scanning the horizon for any sign of that ship. I never saw it again, but I felt it. I felt like I was being watched, like something was out there just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. And sometimes, when the fog was thick and the water was still, I'd hear it, a faint creaking sound, like old wood groaning under strain, carried on the wind. I'd paddle back to shore as fast as I could, my heart pounding, and I'd tell myself it was nothing. Just the wind, just the ocean. I moved away from Point Reyes a few months later, took a job down in Santa Cruz, and I haven't been back since. I still surf, but I avoid the fog now. I avoid the mornings when the mist rolls in thick and heavy, and I never go out alone. Because I know what's out there, drifting through the gray, and I know that if I saw it again, I might not make it back to shore. Some things aren't meant to be seen, and some places hold on to their ghosts tighter than they should. Point Reyes is one of those places, and whatever that ship was, it's still out there, waiting in the fog. I was driving through the Ojai backcountry late one night, coming back from visiting my sister in Ventura. It had been one of those visits that leaves you feeling drained, too much wine, too many old arguments rehashed, too many reminders of why we only see each other a few times a year. By the time I left her place, it was past 11, and I had a 2-hour drive ahead of me through the dark hills back to my apartment in Bakersfield. I should have stayed over, but I had work in the morning, and I'd rather drive tired than spend another night on her lumpy couch listening to her husband snore through the walls. Highway 33 is lonely as hell after dark. It's a 2-lane road that winds through the Los Padres National Forest, cutting through mountains and valleys that feel older than anything else in California. During the day, it's beautiful in a harsh, sun-baked way, golden hills covered in scrub brush and oak trees. The occasional ranch spreading out across the landscape, like something from a western. But at night, it's different. The darkness swallows everything, and your headlights only show you a narrow tunnel of asphalt and dirt shoulder. There's no cell service for most of the drive. No towns, no gas stations, just you and the road and whatever's out there in the hills. I was about 20 miles from Ojai, maybe 45 minutes into the drive, when I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder, lit up suddenly in my headlights as I came around a bend. A young woman, maybe early 20s, wearing a white dress that looked too thin for the cold. The temperature had dropped since I left Ventura, and I had the heater on full blast. But she was standing there in that thin dress like it was the middle of summer. She didn't have a thumb out or anything, wasn't waving or trying to flag me down. She was just standing there, staring at the road, perfectly still. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I had told me to keep my foot on the gas and not look back. You don't stop for hitchhikers on a road like this, especially not at midnight, especially not when they're standing in the middle of nowhere wearing a white dress like something out of a bad dream. But I slowed down. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way she was standing there, so still and so alone. Or maybe it was just the wine making me stupider than usual. I told myself I'd just ask if she was okay, if she needed me to call someone, and then I'd keep going. I pulled over about 10 feet past her and put the car in park, leaving the engine running. In the rearview mirror, I could see her standing there, still not moving, and for a second I thought maybe she hadn't noticed me stop. But then she started walking toward the car, slow and deliberate, her white dress catching the red glow of my taillights. I unlocked the passenger door, and she opened it and got in without saying a word. Up close, she looked even younger, maybe 19 or 20, with long dark hair that hung loose around her shoulders and pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the dashboard. Her face was blank, expressionless, and she didn't look at me as she closed the door and buckled her seatbelt. I asked where she was headed, trying to keep my voice casual, like this was a perfectly normal situation. Up the road, she said, her voice flat and quiet, barely louder than a whisper. I waited for her to say more, to give me a town name or a landmark, but she just sat there, staring straight ahead through the windshield. I put the car back in drive and pulled onto the highway, my hands gripping the wheel a little tighter than they needed to. The silence in the car was thick and uncomfortable, and I found myself glancing over at her every few seconds, trying to figure out what was wrong. She didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there with her hands folded in her lap, perfectly still, like a statue. Her dress was even thinner than I'd thought, almost sheer, and I couldn't understand how she wasn't freezing. The heater was blasting, but she didn't seem to notice. I tried to make conversation, asked her if she lived around here, if she needed a ride to a specific address. She didn't answer, just kept staring straight ahead, her face blank, her breathing so quiet I couldn't hear it over the hum of the engine. I told myself she was probably in shock. Maybe she'd been in an accident or had a fight with someone and was too upset to talk. But something about her felt wrong. The way she sat so perfectly still, the way her eyes didn't track the road or the passing landscape, the way the air in the car seemed colder despite the heater running full blast. I drove for maybe 10 minutes, the road winding through the dark hills, my headlights cutting through the blackness. I kept glancing over at her, and each time I did, she looked exactly the same, hands folded, eyes forward, expression blank. I started to feel uneasy, a cold prickle running down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I thought about asking her to get out, just pulling over and telling her I couldn't take her any farther, but I didn't want to be rude. And part of me, a stupid part, was curious. I wanted to know where she was going, why she'd been standing out there in the middle of nowhere. Then I looked over again, and she was gone. Just gone. The passenger seat was empty, the seatbelt still buckled but hanging loose against the backrest. The door was still closed, the lock still engaged. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the asphalt, and I twisted around to check the back seat. Nothing, no one. The car was empty except for me. I pulled over onto the shoulder, my hands shaking, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I got out of the car, leaving the engine running and the headlights on, and walked around to the passenger side. The door was still closed, no sign that it had been opened. I checked the back seat, the trunk, even looked under the car, but there was nothing. She was just gone, like she'd never been there at all. I stood there on the side of the road, the cold wind cutting through my jacket, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe she'd gotten out when I wasn't looking, slipped out while I was focused on the road. But I would have heard the door open, felt the rush of cold air, noticed the change in the weight of the car, and the seatbelt, it was still buckled when I looked over and saw the empty seat. You can't unbuckle a seatbelt and open a door without making noise, without the driver noticing. I got back in the car, locked all the doors, and sat there for a long time trying to calm down. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, fallen asleep at the wheel for a few seconds, and dreamed up the girl in the white dress. But I could still feel the cold air that had come into the car when she opened the door. Still remember the sound of her voice, flat and quiet, saying, "Up the road." I hadn't imagined it. She'd been there, and then she wasn't. I drove the rest of the way home with the radio on, loud enough to drown out my thoughts, and I didn't stop again until I was pulling into my apartment complex just after 2 in the morning. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat on my couch, staring at the wall, replaying the drive over and over in my head. The next day, I called my sister to tell her I'd made it home okay, and I mentioned what had happened, trying to make it sound like a funny story, like something weird but harmless. She got quiet on the other end of the line, and then she said, "You stopped for her?" There was something in her voice, a mix of concern and disbelief, that made my stomach drop. I asked what she meant, and she told me to be careful on Highway 33, that it had a reputation. She didn't elaborate, just said she'd heard stories and left it at that. I couldn't let it go. That afternoon, I drove into Ojai and stopped at a gas station on the edge of town. There was an old guy behind the counter, probably in his 70s, with a weathered face and hands that looked like they'd spent decades working outdoors. I bought a coffee and asked him, as casually as I could, if he'd ever heard stories about Highway 33. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he said, "What kind of stories?" I told him about the girl in the white dress, about picking her up and having her vanish from the passenger seat. He didn't laugh or look at me like I was crazy. He just nodded, slow and deliberate, and said, "Yeah, people have been picking up that same girl for decades. She always disappears. No one knows who she is or why she's there." I asked him if he knew anything else, if there was a name or a story behind it, but he just shrugged. He said he'd heard different versions over the years. Some people said she was a bride who died on her wedding night. Others said she was a hitchhiker who got murdered back in the 50s or 60s. A few people claimed she was something older, something that had been on that road long before there were cars. But no one knew for sure. All they knew was that she appeared on Highway 33, always in the same spot, always wearing the same white dress, and she always vanished before you got where you were going. He told me he'd never seen her himself, but he knew people who had. One guy, a truck driver who used to haul produce through the area, said he'd picked her up 3 times over the years, and each time it was the same. She'd get in, sit in silence, and then disappear. After the 3rd time, He refused to drive that road at night anymore. Another woman, a local who'd lived in Ojai her whole life, said she'd seen the girl standing on the shoulder dozens of times but never stopped. She said everyone in town knew better. I thanked him and left, feeling more unsettled than before. I wanted there to be an explanation, something rational, that would let me write the whole thing off as a trick of the light or a lapse in my memory. But the old man's words stuck with me. People have been picking up that same girl for decades. She always disappears. I started researching when I got home, searching online for any mention of a ghost or a hitchhiker on Highway 33. I found a few threads on paranormal forums, people sharing stories that matched mine almost exactly. A girl in a white dress, standing on the shoulder, getting in the car and then vanishing. Some people said they felt cold when she was in the car, that the temperature dropped so low they could see their breath. Others said they heard her whisper something before she disappeared, but they could never make out the words. One person claimed they'd seen her standing in the middle of the road, and when they swerved to avoid hitting her, she was gone, and they crashed into a ditch. There were older stories too, newspaper clippings scanned and uploaded to archives. A mention in a 1967 article about strange occurrences on California highways, describing a phantom hitchhiker on Highway 33 who had been reported by multiple drivers. An even older story from the 1940s, written by a rancher who claimed to have picked up a young woman in a white dress near the same spot, only to have her vanish from his truck before he reached town. The stories went back decades, maybe longer, and they were all the same. I don't drive Highway 33 anymore. I take the long way now, even if it adds an hour to the trip, even if it means paying more for gas. I've thought about going back, just to see if she's still there, standing on the shoulder in her white dress, but I can't bring myself to do it, because I know what I saw, and I know that if I stop for her again, she'll get in. She'll sit there in silence, staring straight ahead, and then she'll vanish. And I don't know what happens if you pick her up too many times. If there's a limit to how many times you can see her before something changes. I don't want to find out. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about her. I wonder who she was, why she's still out there, what she's waiting for. And I wonder if she's still standing on that road, lit up in someone else's headlights, waiting for the next person who's stupid enough to stop. My boyfriend and I went camping in Joshua Tree National Park one spring, just the two of us, trying to get away from the city for a few days. We'd been living in Los Angeles for almost a year by then, both of us working jobs that left us exhausted and irritable, and we needed a break. He'd been talking about Joshua Tree for months, showing me pictures of the strange, twisted trees and the rock formations that looked like they'd been dropped there by something ancient and deliberate. I wasn't as enthusiastic. I'd never been much of a camper, but I agreed because I thought it might be good for us, a chance to reconnect without the noise and the traffic and the constant pressure of the city. We drove out on a Friday afternoon, his old truck loaded with camping gear we'd borrowed from his brother. The drive took about 3 hours, and by the time we reached the park entrance, the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, turning the desert gold and orange. The landscape was alien, nothing like the mountains or forests I was used to. Everything was dry and sharp, covered in rocks and scrub brush, and those bizarre Joshua trees that looked more like sculptures than living things. The air smelled like dust and creosote, and the silence was so complete it felt heavy, like something pressing down on my chest. We found a campsite near a cluster of Joshua trees, far enough from the main road that we couldn't hear other campers or cars. My boyfriend was excited, talking about how remote it was, how we'd be able to see the stars without any light pollution. I helped him set up the tent, a small two-person dome that we staked into the rocky ground, and we built a fire as the sun went down. For a while, everything was fine. We cooked hot dogs on sticks, drank beer from a cooler, and watched the sky turn from orange to purple to black. The stars came out, more than I'd ever seen in my life, scattered across the sky like someone had thrown a handful of diamonds. Everything was fine until the sun went down completely. That's when we heard it, a sound like someone screaming, high-pitched and agonized, coming from somewhere in the desert. It started suddenly, cutting through the silence, and it was so loud and so close that I jumped, spilling my beer into the dirt. My boyfriend stood up, staring out into the darkness, and asked if I'd heard it. I nodded, my heart pounding, and we waited. The screaming stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then it started again, the same sound, high-pitched and terrible, like someone in unbearable pain. It would start, go on for maybe 10 seconds, then stop. Then it would start again. We couldn't figure out where it was coming from. The sound seemed to move, shifting direction every time. One moment it sounded like it was coming from the north, near the rocks. The next moment it was to the south, somewhere deeper in the desert. My boyfriend thought it was a coyote or a mountain lion, and he said so, trying to sound calm and reasonable. But I've heard those before. I grew up in Arizona, and I know what coyotes sound like when they're howling or fighting. This was different. This sounded human. We sat by the fire, listening, and the screaming continued. It would stop for a minute or two, long enough that we'd start to relax, and then it would start again, louder and closer. My boyfriend kept saying it was an animal, that the desert played tricks with sound, that we were just spooked because it was dark and unfamiliar. But I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands kept clenching and unclenching, and I knew he was as scared as I was. Around 10 o'clock, we decided to go into the tent. The fire was burning low, and we didn't want to waste our flashlight batteries. So we zipped ourselves into the tent and lay there in the dark, listening. The screaming didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. It would come in waves, sometimes from one direction, sometimes from another, and it sounded like it was getting closer. I pressed myself against my boyfriend's side, my hands shaking, and he put his arm around me, but I could feel his heart racing through his shirt. The tent felt too thin, too fragile, like the only thing separating us from whatever was out there was a sheet of nylon. I kept imagining something circling the campsite, moving through the darkness, watching us. My boyfriend whispered that we should try to sleep, that it would probably stop eventually, but I knew neither of us was going to sleep. We just lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to that terrible sound. Hours passed. The screaming would stop for 10 or 15 minutes, and we'd start to hope it was over, and then it would start again, sometimes so loud it felt like it was right outside the tent. I started crying at some point, quietly, and my boyfriend held me tighter, but he didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. We were stuck out there, miles from anyone, with no cell service and no way to call for help. All we could do was wait. Around 3 a.m., it stopped. The silence was so sudden and so complete that it felt wrong, like the world had been muted. We lay there, barely breathing, waiting for it to start again, but it didn't. The desert was quiet, and after a while, I could hear the faint rustle of wind through the Joshua trees and the distant sound of something small moving through the brush. My boyfriend whispered that it was over, that whatever it was had moved on, and I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching us, waiting. We didn't sleep. We just lay there, holding each other, until the sky started to lighten and the sun came up. In the morning, we packed up as fast as we could, barely speaking, throwing everything into the truck without bothering to organize it. The desert looked harmless in the daylight, almost beautiful, but I couldn't stand to be there another second. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the rocks and the Joshua trees, half expecting to see something watching us. But there was nothing, just the empty desert and the wind. We drove back to Los Angeles in silence, and I swore I'd never go back to Joshua Tree. My boyfriend tried to talk about it once, a few days later, saying maybe we just heard a fox or a bobcat, something we weren't familiar with, but I shut him down. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to think about it. I just wanted to forget. But I couldn't forget. The sound stayed with me, playing in my head when I was trying to fall asleep, echoing through my dreams. A few weeks later, I started searching online, looking for anything that might explain what we'd heard. I typed in "screaming in Joshua Tree" and hit enter, half expecting to find nothing. But there were stories, lots of them. Forum posts, blog entries, comments on camping websites. Other campers who'd heard the same thing, always near the Joshua trees, always at night. Some of them described it exactly the way I would have, high-pitched, agonized, sounding almost human. Others said it was worse than that it sounded like multiple voices screaming at once, or like something trying to mimic a human scream but getting it wrong. Some people said it was the wind moving through the rocks, that the desert had a way of amplifying and distorting sound, making natural noises seem unnatural. Others said it was an animal, maybe a fox or a mountain lion, though no one could agree on which. But there were other explanations, too, stranger ones. A few people claimed it was something old, something that had been in the desert long before the park was established, long before there were people out there camping and hiking. They said the Joshua trees were sacred to certain tribes, that the land had a history most people didn't know about, and that there were things out there that didn't want to be disturbed. One post stuck with me. It was written by a guy who said he'd been camping in Joshua Tree for years, always in the same area, and he'd heard the screaming multiple times. He said it was always the same, starting around sunset, going on for hours, then stopping abruptly around 3 a.m. He said he'd tried to find the source once, walking out into the desert with a flashlight, but the sound kept moving, always staying just out of reach. He said he'd found tracks once, near one of the Joshua trees, but they didn't match any animal he knew. They were too big, too deep, and they disappeared after a few feet, like whatever made them had just vanished into the ground. I read that post over and over, and I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach, because we'd heard the same thing, the same pattern, starting at sunset, going for hours, stopping at 3 a.m. And I remembered the way the sound had seemed to move, always staying just out of reach, like it was circling us, studying us. My boyfriend and I broke up a few months later. It wasn't because of Joshua Tree, or at least that's what I told myself, but I think it was part of it. We never talked about that night again after the first few days, but I could tell it had affected him too. He started sleeping with the lights on, and he'd get jumpy at sudden noises, things that never would have bothered him before. We tried to go back to normal, but something had changed between us, like we'd seen something we weren't supposed to see, and it had left a mark. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm alone in the quiet. I think about the sound, the way it moved through the desert, the way it seemed almost alive, almost intelligent. And I think about the silence that came after, the way it felt like the world had been holding its breath. I've read everything I can find about Joshua Tree, about the history of the land and the people who lived there before it became a park. There are stories, old ones, about spirits that lived in the desert, things that didn't like to be seen or disturbed. Some tribes believed the Joshua trees were gateways, that they marked places where the world was thin, where things from the other side could cross over. I don't know if I believe that. I don't know what I believe. But I know what I heard that night, and I know it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that's been out there a lot longer than we have, and it's still there now, waiting in the desert. I've thought about going back, just to see, just to know for sure, but I can't bring myself to do it. Because part of me is terrified that if I go back, I'll hear it again. And part of me is even more terrified that this time, I'll see what's making the sound. I still have nightmares about it. I'll be back in that tent, lying in the dark, listening to the screaming getting closer and closer. And in the dream, I always unzip the tent and look outside, even though I know I shouldn't. And there's something standing there, just beyond the firelight, something tall and wrong, with too many limbs and a mouth that's open too wide. And it's screaming, that same high-pitched, agonized sound, but it's looking right at me, and I know it's been waiting for me to come back. I wake up before I see its face, my heart pounding, my sheets soaked with sweat, and I lie there in the dark, listening to the silence, and I wonder if it's still out there, standing in the desert, screaming into the night. And I wonder how many other people have heard it, how many other campers have packed up and left in the morning, swearing they'll never go back. And I wonder if any of them were brave enough or stupid enough to go looking for the source, and what they found when they did. I took a photography trip to the Salton Sea a few years ago, hoping to get some shots of the abandoned buildings and dead fish along the shore. I was going through a phase back then, trying to find my style as a photographer, and I'd become obsessed with decay places that had been left behind, structures slowly being reclaimed by nature or time. The Salton Sea seemed perfect for that. I'd seen pictures online, haunting images of rusted playground equipment and collapsed motels, and I wanted to capture that same sense of abandonment, that feeling of a place forgotten by the world. The drive out there from San Diego took about 2.5 hours, most of it through desert that looked like it had given up on life. The closer I got to the sea, the more desolate everything became. Fewer cars on the road, fewer signs of civilization, just empty stretches of cracked earth and scrub brush baking under a sun that felt too close, too hot. When I finally reached the shoreline, I understood why people called it the most depressing place in California. The place is eerie as hell, dead quiet, stinking of sulfur, with rusted out trailers and rotting docks everywhere. The water itself looked wrong, milky and still, like something that had been sitting stagnant for decades. I parked near what used to be a marina, now just a collection of broken pilings and collapsed boat launches. The air smelled terrible, a mix of sulfur and rotting fish, and I could see the beach covered in a thick crust of dried algae and fish bones. Thousands of them, maybe millions, scattered across the sand like some kind of biblical plague. I grabbed my camera and started walking, trying not to breathe too deeply, focusing on finding the right angles, the right light. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, and everything had that golden hour glow that photographers love. But there was something oppressive about it too, like the beauty was just a thin layer over something rotten underneath. I spent about an hour walking along the shore, taking pictures of the abandoned buildings, a motel with its roof caved in, a gas station with shattered windows, a playground with rusted swings hanging motionless in the still air. The whole place felt like a graveyard, not just for the buildings but for the dreams people had once had about this place. The Salton Sea was supposed to be a resort destination back in the 50s and 60s, a playground for celebrities and families looking to escape the city. But the water had turned toxic, the fish had died, and everyone had left. Now it was just a monument to failure, slowly rotting under the desert sun. I was walking along the beach in the late afternoon, the water still and murky, when I saw something floating near the surface. At first, I thought it was debris, maybe an old tire or a piece of driftwood caught in the shallows. I'd been seeing trash all day, plastic bottles, chunks of styrofoam, things that had washed up and been left behind. But something about this caught my eye, the way it was just beneath the surface, pale and round. I walked closer, my camera hanging around my neck, and crouched down at the edge of the water to get a better look. It was a face, a human face, pale and bloated, staring up through the water. The features were distorted, swollen, but unmistakably human. A nose, a mouth, eyes that were open and unblinking, staring up at nothing. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and nearly dropped my camera. My first thought was that I'd found a body, that someone had drowned and their corpse had floated to the surface. I pulled out my phone, ready to call the police, and then I saw another one. About 10 feet to my left, another face, just beneath the surface, staring up with the same blank expression, and then another one, farther out, and another one closer to the shore. I stood there, frozen, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and I realized there were dozens of them, dozens of faces, all just beneath the surface, all facing upward, their eyes open and unblinking. They were everywhere, scattered across the water like some kind of terrible crop, and they weren't moving. They were just there, floating, staring. I ran back to my car, shaking, my hands fumbling with the keys. I locked the doors as soon as I was inside and sat there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe they were mannequins, dumped in the water as some kind of sick joke. Maybe they were algae formations, something about the shape and the light making them look like faces. But I knew what I'd seen. They were faces, human faces, and there were too many of them, scattered too evenly, for it to be anything accidental. I drove straight out of there, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, miles away from the shore, and even then I couldn't shake the image. Those faces, pale and bloated, staring up through the murky water. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of optical illusion, maybe debris or algae formations, something my brain had misinterpreted in the fading light. But I've never been able to shake the image. It's burned into my memory, as clear now as it was that day. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying what I'd seen over and over. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and pulled out my laptop, searching for anything that might explain it. I typed in bodies in Salton Sea and faces in the water, and I found more than I wanted to. There were stories, lots of them, scattered across forums and blog posts and local news archives. Stories about people drowning in the Salton Sea over the years, swimmers and boaters who'd gone under and never come back up. The water is toxic now, full of chemicals and pollutants, and the locals say it does strange things, that it preserves things in ways water shouldn't. I read about the history of the sea, how it was created by accident in 1905 when the Colorado River breached an irrigation canal and flooded the Salton Sink. For a while, it was a thriving ecosystem, full of fish and birds, and people flocked to its shores. But the water had no outlet, and as it sat under the desert sun, it became saltier and saltier, more toxic, until nothing could survive in it. The fish died by the millions, and the resorts closed, and the people left. But the water stayed, stagnant and poisonous. And some locals say the sea holds onto its dead, that the bodies never really leave. There were forum posts from people who claimed to have seen the same thing I did. One guy said he'd been fishing near the shore and saw faces in the water, dozens of them, all staring up at him. He said he reported it to the police, but when they came out to investigate, they didn't find anything. Another woman said she'd been walking her dog along the beach and saw a face floating just beneath the surface. She said she reached into the water to pull it out, thinking it was a person who needed help, but when she touched it, it disintegrated, breaking apart like wet paper. I found an old newspaper article from the 70s, scanned and uploaded to an archive site, about a group of teenagers who drowned during a party at the Salton Sea. Their bodies were never recovered, and the article quoted a local sheriff saying the water was too murky, too dangerous to send divers in. The families had demanded a search, but after a few days, it was called off. The article ended with a quote from one of the mothers, saying she didn't believe her son was gone, that she felt like he was still out there, waiting. I kept searching, deeper and deeper, until I found references to older stories, legends that predated the Salton Sea itself. The Salton Sink, the dry lakebed that had existed before the flood, had its own history. The indigenous people who lived in the area had stories about the land, about spirits that lived in the basin, things that waited in the dry earth for water to return. When the sea was formed, some of those stories resurfaced, twisted into new forms. People said the water had awakened something, that the sea wasn't just toxic, it was hungry. I didn't want to believe any of it. I wanted to think I'd seen debris, algae, something explainable. But the more I read, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen was real. Those faces weren't optical illusions or formations. They were something else, something the sea had kept. A few weeks later, I went back. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could prove to myself that I'd imagined it, that in the daylight, with a clear head, I'd see the truth. I drove out there on a Saturday morning, the sun already brutal by the time I reached the shore. I walked to the same spot where I'd seen the faces, my camera in my hands, ready to document whatever I found. The water was still murky, and the smell was just as bad as I remembered. I stood at the edge, looking down into the shallows, and at first, I didn't see anything. Just water, thick and opaque, and the occasional piece of trash floating near the surface. I started to relax, started to convince myself that I'd overreacted, that my mind had played tricks on me. Then the water shifted, just slightly, and I saw it. A face, pale and bloated, staring up at me from just beneath the surface. And then another one, and another one, appearing as the water moved, like they'd been waiting for me to come back. I raised my camera, my hands shaking, and took a picture. The shutter clicked, and the faces were gone, disappearing back into the murky water, like they'd never been there. I checked the photo on my camera's screen, and it showed nothing, just water, dark and still. I took another picture, and another, but every time I looked at the screen, there was nothing. Just the sea, empty and lifeless. But when I looked up, they were there. Dozens of them, staring up at me with their blank, unblinking eyes. I left the Salton Sea that day, and I've never been back. I don't know what I saw. I don't know if those faces were the dead who drowned there over the years, or if they were something older, something the sea had pulled up from the earth when it was formed. But I know they were real, and I know they're still there, waiting just beneath the surface. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that place. I think about the faces, pale and bloated, staring up through the water. And I think about the people who drowned there, the ones whose bodies were never found. I wonder if they're still there, trapped in that toxic water, unable to leave. And I wonder if the sea is waiting, patient and still, for more people to come, more bodies to add to its collection. I deleted all the photos I took that day. I couldn't stand to look at them, even though they showed nothing, because I knew what was there, just beneath the surface. And I knew that no camera could capture it. Some things don't want to be seen. Some things stay hidden, waiting in the murky water. And the only way you know they're there is if you're unlucky enough to look down at the right moment and see them staring back. A group of us rented a cabin near Big Bear Lake for a long weekend in February, just to get away and do some snowboarding. There were 5 of us total: me, my roommate Derek, his girlfriend Amy, and 2 guys from work, Marcus and Josh. We'd all been talking about getting out of the city for months, and when Derek found the cabin listed online for cheap, we jumped on it. The pictures looked decent enough: a 2-story A-frame tucked into the woods, with a stone fireplace and enough beds for everyone. The listing said it had been in the owner's family for decades, which we thought meant it would have character. We didn't think much beyond that. The drive up took about 3 hours from Los Angeles, and by the time we arrived, it was already getting dark. The cabin was old, set back in the trees at the end of a narrow dirt road that had been partially plowed but was still treacherous with ice. We parked as close as we could and hauled our bags through about 50 feet of snow to reach the front door. The place looked even older in person. The wood siding was dark and weathered, and there were icicles hanging from the eaves that looked like they'd been there all winter. The owner had left the key under the mat, and when we let ourselves in, the air inside smelled like old wood and dust, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't quite place. The interior was rustic in a way that felt almost deliberate, like someone had tried to preserve it exactly as it had been built. The furniture was heavy and dark, the kind of stuff you'd find in your grandparents' house, and there were old photographs on the walls, black and white images of stern-looking people standing in front of the cabin, some of them holding rifles or axes. The fireplace dominated one wall, and there was a stack of firewood beside it that looked like it had been sitting there for years. Upstairs, there were 3 small bedrooms with sloped ceilings and narrow beds covered in quilts that smelled faintly of mothballs. Everything was fine the first night. We drank beer, played cards, stayed up late, talking around the fire. Derek and Amy took one of the upstairs bedrooms, Marcus and Josh took another, and I set up a sleeping bag on the couch downstairs. The cabin was cold despite the fire, and I could hear the wind outside rattling the windows, but it felt cozy in that isolated, away from the world kind of way. I fell asleep listening to the crackle of the dying fire and the murmur of conversation from upstairs. The second night, things got strange. We'd spent the day snowboarding at the resort, and by the time we got back to the cabin, we were exhausted. We made dinner pasta and canned sauce, heated on the old gas stove, and settled in for another night of cards and drinking. Around 10 o'clock, we started hearing footsteps on the roof. They were heavy and deliberate, like someone walking back and forth, and they made a distinct crunching sound against the snow and ice that had accumulated up there. At first, we thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a possum, but the footsteps were too rhythmic, too measured. They sounded human. Derek stood up and grabbed a flashlight, and we all went outside to check. The cold hit us immediately, sharp and biting, and the snow crunched under our boots as we walked around the perimeter of the cabin. We shone the flashlight up at the roof, scanning the edges, but there was nothing, no tracks in the snow, no ladder, no sign that anyone or anything had been up there. The footsteps had stopped the moment we stepped outside, and the silence was total, oppressive. We stood there for a few minutes, our breath fogging in the frigid air, and then we went back inside, convinced we'd imagined it or that it had been some trick of the wind. But as soon as we closed the door and sat back down, the footsteps started again. This time they were louder, more insistent, pacing back and forth directly above where we were sitting. Amy looked terrified, her face pale in the firelight, and Marcus said we should call the owner. But there was no cell service up there, and the cabin didn't have a landline. We were on our own. The footsteps continued for about 20 minutes, and then they stopped. For a while, there was nothing, and we started to relax, started to convince ourselves that it had been an animal after all, something that had crawled onto the roof and then left. But then the sounds moved to the walls, tapping and scraping, always just out of sight, like someone was running their fingers along the outside of the cabin, testing the wood. The sounds would start on one wall, move around to another, then stop and start again somewhere else. It felt deliberate, methodical, like whatever was making the noise was circling the cabin, looking for a way in. We huddled together in the living room, too scared to move, listening to the sounds move around us. Josh suggested we leave, just pack up and drive back to the city. But it was past midnight and the road was icy, and none of us felt safe driving in the dark. So we stayed, sitting by the fire, waiting for morning. Around 1 a.m., Amy said she needed to use the bathroom. There was one downstairs, a small room off the kitchen with a cracked mirror and a toilet that groaned when you flushed it. She went in and closed the door, and a few seconds later, she screamed. We all jumped up and ran to the bathroom, and when Derek threw the door open, Amy was standing there, her hand over her mouth, staring at the small closet beside the sink. The closet door was open, and inside, on the back of the door, were scratches. Deep gouges in the wood, running vertically from top to bottom, like someone had been trying to claw their way out. The scratches were fresh, the wood was lighter where it had been torn, and there were splinters scattered on the floor. We left the next morning as soon as the sun came up. None of us had slept. We'd spent the rest of the night sitting together in the living room, the fire burning low, listening to the occasional creak of the cabin settling or the wind moving through the trees. The scratching had stopped around 3 a.m., and the silence that followed was somehow worse, thick and heavy, like the cabin was holding its breath. When we packed up and walked out to the car, I turned back to look at the cabin one last time. In the daylight, it looked harmless, almost picturesque, with the snow piled up against the walls and the smoke from the dying fire curling up from the chimney. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from inside, waiting for us to leave so it could go back to whatever it had been doing before we arrived. When I got back to Los Angeles, I called the owner to complain. I didn't know what I was going to say, didn't know if I expected him to believe me, but I felt like I had to tell someone. He answered on the third ring, his voice gruff and impatient, and I told him about the footsteps, the scratching, the gouges on the closet door. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then he asked, "Did you hear anything?" His voice had changed, gotten quieter, and I could hear something in it that I hadn't heard before, not surprise, but resignation, like he'd been expecting this call. I told him everything, and when I finished, he sighed. "Yeah, that happens sometimes," he said. "My grandfather built that cabin on old land. We don't really know what was there before." I asked him what he meant, what he thought was happening, but he didn't answer. He just said he was sorry for the inconvenience and that he'd consider a partial refund, though he never followed through. Then he hung up, and I was left sitting in my apartment, staring at my phone, trying to make sense of what he'd said. I started researching the area after that, trying to find out what he meant by old land. Big Bear Lake has a history, older than the resort towns and vacation cabins that sprung up in the last century. The area was home to the Serrano people for thousands of years before European settlers arrived, and there are stories, fragments of oral history, that have been recorded and preserved about places in the mountains that were considered sacred or forbidden, places where the dead were left, where spirits were said to linger, where the living were not supposed to build or stay. I found references to burial grounds, some of them documented, others just rumors passed down through generations. I found stories about settlers in the 1800s who'd built cabins in certain areas and then abandoned them, claiming the land was cursed or haunted. And I found forum posts, modern accounts from people who'd rented cabins or camped in the Big Bear area and experienced things they couldn't explain: footsteps, scratching, voices, shadows moving through the trees. Some of them mentioned the same thing the owner had said, that the land was old, that there were things there that didn't want to be disturbed. I don't know what we heard that night in the cabin. I don't know if it was something trying to get in or something that was already inside, trapped and angry. But I know the scratches on that closet door were real, and I know the footsteps on the roof and the walls were deliberate, purposeful. And I know that when the owner said his grandfather had built the cabin on old land, he wasn't just talking about the age of the trees or the mountains. He was talking about something deeper, something that had been there long before his family, long before any of us, and something that was still there, waiting. I've never been back to Big Bear. None of us have. Derek and Amy broke up a few months later, and we don't talk about that weekend. Marcus moved to San Francisco, and Josh got married and deleted his social media. We all scattered, like we were trying to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and that cabin. But I still think about it sometimes, especially on cold nights when I'm alone and the wind is rattling the windows. I think about the footsteps pacing back and forth on the roof, the scratching moving around the walls, the gouges on the closet door, and I think about what the owner said, that his grandfather had built the cabin on old land, and I wonder what was there before, what's still there now, and whether it's still waiting for someone else to come, someone else to hear the footsteps and feel the walls shake, someone else to open that closet door and see the scratches left by whatever tried to get out. I used to hike Griffith Park all the time when I lived in Los Angeles, back when I was working a dead-end job in Silver Lake and needed somewhere to go where I could think. The park was close enough that I could drive there after work, park near the observatory, and walk the trails until the sun went down. It was one of the few places in the city where you could feel alone, where the noise and the traffic faded into something quieter, more manageable. I'd been hiking there for about 6 months when I first heard about the tunnel. It came up in a conversation with a guy I met on the trail near the Bronson Caves, a local who'd been hiking the park for years. We got to talking about hidden spots, places most tourists didn't know about, and he mentioned an old maintenance tunnel somewhere near the caves. He said it was partially collapsed, with a chain-link fence blocking the entrance, but if you knew where to look and you were careful, you could slip through. He said he'd never been inside himself, but he knew people who had, and they all said the same thing. It went deep, farther than it should, and it felt wrong in a way they couldn't explain. I didn't think much of it at the time, just filed it away as one of those urban legends people tell to make a place seem more interesting than it is. But a few weeks later, I found myself thinking about it. I'd been hiking the same trails over and over, and I was getting bored, restless. I wanted to see something new, something most people didn't see. So one Saturday afternoon, I drove up to the park, parked near the Bronson Caves, and started looking for the tunnel. It took me about 20 minutes of wandering off the main trail, pushing through brush and climbing over rocks, before I found it. The entrance was exactly where the guy had described, tucked into a hillside, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation, with a rusted chain-link fence bolted across the opening. The fence had a gap at the bottom, just wide enough for someone to squeeze through if they were determined. I stood there for a minute, staring at the dark mouth of the tunnel, and I felt a flicker of doubt. The air coming out of the tunnel was cold and damp, and it smelled like mold and old concrete. But I'd come this far, and I wasn't going to turn back now. I pulled a flashlight out of my backpack, crouched down, and slipped through the gap in the fence. The tunnel was narrow and damp, with graffiti on the walls and trash scattered on the ground, beer cans, cigarette butts, old fast food wrappers. The floor was uneven, cracked in places, and there was standing water in some of the lower spots that reflected the beam of my flashlight. The walls were concrete, stained dark with moisture and age, and the ceiling was low enough that I had to duck in places. I could hear water dripping somewhere deeper in the tunnel, a steady rhythmic sound that echoed in the darkness. I walked for maybe 5 minutes, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the blackness ahead of me, and the tunnel seemed to go on forever. I'd expected it to end quickly, to hit a collapse or a dead end, but it just kept going, sloping gently downward, the air getting colder and damper the farther I went. I started to feel uneasy, that instinctive sense that you're somewhere you shouldn't be, but I kept walking. I wanted to see how far it went, wanted to find whatever was at the end. Then I heard voices, low, murmuring, like a group of people talking somewhere ahead. I stopped, my heart suddenly pounding, and listened. The voices were indistinct, just a low hum of conversation, but they sounded close, maybe 50 feet ahead. I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. "Hello? Is someone there?" The voices stopped immediately, and the silence that followed was so complete it felt oppressive, like the tunnel was holding its breath. I stood there, my flashlight beam trembling slightly in my hand, and waited. The voices didn't start again. I told myself it was probably other explorers, kids from the neighborhood who'd come down here to drink or smoke, and they'd gotten spooked when they heard me. But something about the silence felt wrong, too deliberate, like whatever had been making the noise was waiting for me to move. I kept walking, slower now, my footsteps echoing loudly in the quiet. The tunnel curved slightly to the left, and as I rounded the bend, I saw them shadows on the tunnel wall. Dozens of them, moving and shifting like they were cast by people standing just around the corner. The shadows were elongated and distorted, flickering in the beam of my flashlight, and they moved in ways that didn't make sense, overlapping and separating, pacing back and forth. I could hear the faint sound of movement, the scuff of feet against concrete, the rustle of fabric, but I couldn't see anyone. I turned the corner, my breath shallow and fast, and the tunnel ahead was empty. Just an empty stretch of concrete, water dripping from the ceiling, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The shadows were gone. There was no one there. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. The shadows had been so clear, so detailed, and the sounds had been real. I'd heard them. But there was no one here. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back, just turned and ran the way I'd come, my flashlight bouncing wildly, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear my footsteps echoing behind me, or maybe it was someone else's footsteps. I couldn't tell. I just kept running, splashing through the puddles, stumbling over the uneven ground, until I saw the light from the entrance ahead. I squeezed through the gap in the fence, tearing my jacket on the rusted metal, and didn't stop until I was out in the sunlight, gasping for air, my hands shaking. I sat on a rock for a long time, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it or that it had been some trick of the light. But I knew what I'd seen. The shadows had been real, and so had the voices, and the empty tunnel where there should have been people. I thought about going back, just to prove to myself that it was nothing, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The fear was too strong, too visceral, and I knew that if I went back down there, I'd see them again, and I didn't want to see them again. When I got home, I started researching the tunnel. I typed in Griffith Park Tunnel, Bronson Caves Maintenance Tunnel, anything I could think of, and I found scattered references, forum posts, and old articles. The tunnel had been built in the early 1900s, part of the infrastructure for the park, used for maintenance and water runoff. But during Prohibition, it had supposedly been used for smuggling, a hidden route for moving alcohol through the hills. There were stories about people disappearing down there, bootleggers and runners who went into the tunnel and never came out. Some people said the tunnel connected to older passages, ones that were there long before the park, carved out by miners, or maybe even earlier, by people whose names had been forgotten. I found one forum post that stuck with me. It was from a guy who claimed to have gone into the tunnel in the 90s, back before the fence was put up. He said he'd walked for about 10 minutes before he heard voices, the same low murmuring I'd heard, and he'd followed them deeper into the tunnel. He said he'd seen shadows on the walls, dozens of them, moving like they were cast by people just out of sight, but when he turned the corner, there was no one there. He said he'd kept walking, deeper and deeper, following the voices and the shadows, until he realized the tunnel was changing. The walls were older, rougher, like they'd been carved by hand instead of built with concrete. And the air smelled different, not like mold and water, but like earth, and something metallic, like old blood. He said he'd turned back then, terrified, and when he reached the entrance, hours had passed. He'd only been in the tunnel for what felt like 30 minutes, but it was dark outside, and his phone was dead, and he couldn't explain the missing time. He said he'd never gone back, and he advised anyone reading to stay out of the tunnel. He said there were things down there, old things, and they didn't like to be disturbed. I read that post over and over, and I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach, because everything he described matched what I'd experienced. The voices, the shadows, the empty tunnel, and I'd only been in there for 5 minutes, 10 at most. What would have happened if I'd kept going? If I'd followed the voices deeper into the tunnel, past the point where the concrete gave way to something older? I started having dreams about the tunnel after that. I'd be walking through it, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and I'd hear the voices ahead, low and murmuring, always just out of reach. I'd follow them, turning corner after corner, and the tunnel would get narrower and damper, the walls closing in, the air getting colder. And then I'd see the shadows again, dozens of them, moving on the walls, and I'd turn the corner, and there would be people standing there. Not moving, not talking, just standing in the darkness, their faces pale and blank, their eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight like animals. And I'd wake up, gasping, my heart pounding, and I'd lie there in the dark, trying to convince myself it was just a dream. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that the tunnel was real, and the things I'd seen down there were real, and that they were waiting for me to come back. I stopped hiking Griffith Park after that. I told myself it was because I'd gotten busy with work, or because I'd found other places to hike, but the truth was, I was scared. Scared of the tunnel, scared of what I'd seen, and scared of what might happen if I went back. A few months later, I moved out of Los Angeles, took a job in San Francisco, and left the city behind. But I still think about that tunnel sometimes, especially on nights when I can't sleep and my mind wanders to dark places. I think about the voices I heard, the shadows on the walls, the empty tunnel where there should have been people. And I think about the forum post about the guy who said the tunnel was changing, becoming something older, something that didn't belong to the park or the city or even to this time. I don't know what I saw down there. I don't know if it was ghosts or echoes of the people who disappeared in that tunnel, or if it was something else, something that's been there longer than the concrete and the graffiti and the chain link fence. But I know I never want to go back, because I have this feeling, deep and unshakable, that if I went back into that tunnel, if I followed the voices and the shadows far enough, I'd find whatever is at the end, and I'd never come back out. I took a tour of the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose a few years ago, just for fun. I was visiting the Bay Area for work, had an afternoon to kill, and I'd heard about the place, this massive Victorian mansion with staircases that lead to nowhere, doors that open onto walls, and rooms built specifically to confuse spirits. It sounded weird enough to be worth seeing, so I bought a ticket online and showed up for the 2 p.m. tour on a gray Thursday in November. If you don't know the story, Sarah Winchester was the widow of William Winchester, the guy who made a fortune manufacturing rifles. After her husband and infant daughter died, Sarah became convinced she was cursed by the spirits of everyone killed by Winchester rifles. A medium told her she needed to continuously build onto her house to confuse the ghosts and keep them from finding her. So she did. For 38 years, construction never stopped 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By the time she died in 1922, the house had 160 rooms, 2,000 doors, 10,000 windows, and a layout so deliberately confusing that even the workers got lost. The tour guide told us all this as we stood in the grand entrance hall, a group of maybe 15 people clutching our tickets and looking around at the ornate woodwork and stained glass. The guide was enthusiastic, clearly passionate about the history, and she pointed out all the architectural oddities, staircases that climbed to the ceiling and stopped, doors that opened onto brick walls, windows built into floors. It was interesting in a novelty kind of way, but I didn't think much of it. It was just a weird old house with a sad story behind it. We moved through the mansion in a slow procession, stopping in various rooms while the guide explained their purposes or pointed out particularly strange features. There was the seance room where Sarah supposedly communicated with spirits, a tiny door that only came up to my waist, and a staircase with steps that were only 2 inches high, built that way because Sarah had severe arthritis and couldn't climb regular stairs. The house felt oppressive in a way. I hadn't expected. The hallways were narrow and dark, the ceilings low in some places and soaring in others, and everywhere you looked, there were strange angles and dead ends that made your brain itch trying to make sense of them. I was in one of the upstairs hallways, looking at a painting of Sarah Winchester that hung on the wall, when I turned around and realized everyone was gone. The tour group had moved on while I was distracted, and I was standing alone in the narrow corridor. I could hear their voices faintly, somewhere ahead or maybe below me, but I couldn't tell which direction they'd gone. The hallway branched in 3 directions, and I couldn't remember which one we'd come from. I picked a direction and started walking, trying to catch up, but the layout of the house is deliberately confusing. I turned a corner and found myself in another hallway that looked identical to the first, then another, and another. The walls were covered in dark wallpaper, the floors were polished wood that creaked under my feet, and every few yards there was a door, some of them open, some of them closed. I tried one of the open doors and found a staircase that went up about 6 steps and ended at the ceiling. I tried another and found a closet barely big enough to stand in, with hooks on the walls and nothing else. I was starting to feel uneasy, the kind of low-grade panic that comes from being lost in an unfamiliar place, and I pulled out my phone to use the flashlight, but there was no signal, and the battery was almost dead. I kept walking, trying to find my way back to the tour, or at least to a room I recognized, and that's when I ended up in a small, empty room I don't remember passing through before. It was maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with bare wooden floors and walls painted a pale, dingy yellow. There was a single window, but it looked out onto a brick wall, and the light coming through was gray and dim. The room felt wrong somehow, colder than the rest of the house, and the air had a stale, unused quality, like no one had been in there for years. And standing in the corner, her back to me, was a woman in an old-fashioned black dress. The dress was long and heavy-looking, the kind of thing you'd see in a photograph from the late 1800s, with a high collar and long sleeves. Her hair was dark and pinned up, and she was perfectly still, facing the corner like she was staring at the wall. I assumed she was part of the tour, maybe someone dressed in period costume to add atmosphere, and I called out to her, "Excuse me, do you know how to get back to the main group?" She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. I stepped closer, my footsteps loud on the wooden floor, and I said it again, louder this time. "Excuse me?" Still nothing. I was about 5 feet away from her when she turned her head. Not her body, just her head, twisting slowly to look at me over her shoulder. Her face was pale, the kind of pale that doesn't look healthy, and her eyes were empty, not just emotionless but actually empty, like they were looking through me at something I couldn't see. Her mouth was a thin, colorless line, and her skin had a waxy, unnatural texture, like old parchment. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, so intense it felt like I'd stepped into a freezer, and the air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at her, and she stared back, her head still twisted at that unnatural angle, her body perfectly still. And then her mouth moved, just slightly, like she was trying to say something, but no sound came out. Just a faint, dry whisper that I couldn't make out, but that filled me with a dread so deep and visceral I thought I might collapse. I backed out of the room, stumbling, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't look away from her, couldn't look away, until I was out in the hallway again. And when I finally tore my eyes away and looked back into the room, she was gone, just gone. The corner where she'd been standing was empty, and the room looked exactly as it had when I first walked in, bare and cold and unused. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out of that hallway, out of that part of the house. I turned corner after corner, opened doors and closed them, climbed staircases that led to dead ends and backtracked, until finally I found a staircase that looked familiar and followed it down to the first floor. I heard voices and followed them, and a minute later I found the tour group standing in the ballroom, listening to the guide explain the custom-built pipe organ. No one seemed to notice I'd been gone. The guide glanced at me as I slipped back into the group, but she didn't say anything, just continued her explanation. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, trying to calm down, and I listened to her talk about Sarah Winchester's obsession with the number 13 and how the ballroom had 13 windows. But I wasn't really hearing her. I was still thinking about that room, about the woman in the black dress, about the way she turned her head and looked at me with those empty eyes. When the tour ended, I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I didn't know how to explain it, didn't know if anyone would believe me. I just walked out of the house, got in my car, and sat there for a long time, staring at the mansion through the windshield. It looked normal from the outside, just a big, strange house with too many windows and a chaotic roofline. But I knew what I'd seen inside, and I knew it wasn't normal. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my hotel room, staring at the ceiling, replaying what had happened over and over. I kept seeing her face, pale and waxy, and those empty eyes. I kept feeling that wave of cold, that suffocating pressure in the air. Around 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and pulled out my laptop, searching for anything I could find about ghosts at the Winchester Mystery House. There were plenty of stories. Tourists and employees who'd reported seeing figures in period clothing, hearing footsteps in empty hallways, feeling cold spots and sudden drops in temperature. Some people claimed to have seen Sarah Winchester herself, a small woman in a black dress, wandering the upper floors or standing in doorways. Others described shadow figures, voices, the sound of hammering and construction that stopped as soon as you got close. The house had a reputation, and not just because of its strange architecture. People said it was haunted, genuinely haunted, and that Sarah's efforts to confuse the spirits hadn't worked. They were still there, trapped in the maze she'd built, unable to leave. I found one account that matched what I'd experienced almost exactly. It was written by a woman who'd taken a tour in the early 2000s and gotten separated from her group. She'd ended up in a small, empty room on the second floor and seen a woman in a black dress standing in the corner. The woman had turned her head to look at her, and her face had been pale and her eyes empty, and the temperature in the room had dropped so suddenly the tourist could see her breath. She'd run, just like I had, and when she told the tour guide what she'd seen, the guide had gotten very quiet and said that other people had reported the same thing. The guide wouldn't say who the woman was, but the tourist believed it was Sarah Winchester, still wandering the house she'd spent her life building, still trying to escape the spirits that haunted her. I don't know if it was Sarah Winchester I saw in that room. I don't know if it was a ghost or some kind of residual energy, an imprint left behind by decades of fear and obsession. But I know what I felt in that room, the cold, the pressure, the overwhelming sense of dread. And I know that when she looked at me, it wasn't with curiosity or surprise. It was with recognition, like she'd been waiting for someone to find that room, to see her standing there. I left San Jose the next day, and I've never been back to the Winchester Mystery House. I tell people it was interesting, that the architecture was fascinating, but I don't tell them about the woman in the black dress or the empty room or the way the air felt like it was crushing me, because I know how it sounds. I know people would think I imagined it, that I got spooked by the tour guide stories and let my mind run away with me. But I didn't imagine it. I know what I saw. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that house. I think about all those rooms, all those hallways and staircases that lead nowhere, all those doors that open onto walls. And I think about Sarah Winchester, spending 38 years building and rebuilding, never stopping, never resting, convinced that if she stopped, the ghosts would find her. And I wonder if she ever realized that the house wasn't keeping them out. It was keeping them in. And now she's trapped there with them, wandering the maze she built, turning corners and opening doors, looking for a way out that doesn't exist. And I wonder if that's what she was trying to tell me when she looked at me in that empty room, her mouth moving but no sound coming out. If she was trying to warn me, or ask for help, or just let me know that she was still there, still lost in the house she'd built to save herself. I'll never know. But I know I wasn't alone in that room, and I know that whatever I saw, it saw me too. And sometimes, when I'm walking through a building with too many hallways or too many doors, I get this feeling, this prickle at the back of my neck, like someone's watching me. And I turn around, half expecting to see her standing there, her head twisted at that unnatural angle, her empty eyes staring right through me, and I walk a little faster, and I don't look back. There's an old hospital on the outskirts of Riverside that's been shut down for decades. I went there with some friends in high school, the kind of stupid thing you do when you're young and think you're invincible. It was the summer before senior year, and we were bored, looking for something to do that felt rebellious and dangerous without actually being that dangerous. Or so we thought. My friend Marcus had heard about the hospital from his older brother, who said it had been abandoned since the early 90s and was supposedly haunted. We didn't believe in ghosts back then, at least I didn't, but the idea of exploring a creepy old building in the middle of the night sounded like the perfect way to spend a Friday. There were 4 of us, me, Marcus, his girlfriend Jenna, and our friend Kyle. We drove out there around midnight in Marcus's beat-up Honda, following directions we'd pulled from some urban exploration forum. The hospital was way out on the edge of town, past the industrial district, down a road that hadn't been maintained in years. The pavement was cracked and overgrown with weeds, and the streetlights had long since burned out. We almost missed the turnoff, but Marcus spotted the rusted chain-link fence that surrounded the property and pulled over. The building was massive, a sprawling 3-story structure made of red brick that looked black in the darkness. Most of the windows were broken, and graffiti covered every surface we could see, tags and crude drawings, and the occasional phrase like "get out" or "they're still here." The front entrance was boarded up, but someone had pried away enough of the plywood that we could squeeze through. We stood outside for a minute, looking up at the building, and I remember feeling a flutter of unease in my stomach. The place looked wrong somehow, not just abandoned but actively hostile, like it didn't want us there. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to look scared in front of the others. We slipped through the gap in the boards, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, and found ourselves in what used to be the main lobby. The floor was littered with debris, chunks of plaster, broken glass, old newspapers yellowed with age. The reception desk was still there, covered in dust and graffiti, and there was a faded sign on the wall that read, "Riverside General Hospital, established 1952. The air smelled like mildew and old concrete, and it was cold inside, colder than it should have been for a summer night. We wandered through the halls with our flashlights, laughing and joking around, trying to outdare each other. Kyle kept making jokes about zombie patients, and Jenna pretended to be scared, clutching Marcus's arm and squealing whenever we heard a noise. We explored the first floor, peering into empty rooms that had been stripped of everything, valuable beds, medical equipment, even the light fixtures. The walls were water-stained and peeling, and there were dark patches on the ceiling where the roof had leaked. Every room looked the same, just empty shells with broken windows and graffiti on the walls. Then Marcus said he'd heard there was a basement, and that's where things got really creepy. We found the stairwell near the back of the building, a narrow concrete passage with metal railings that were rusted and flaking. The stairs led down into complete darkness, and the air coming up from below was noticeably colder, with a damp, musty smell that made my throat tight. Kyle went first, his flashlight beam bouncing off the walls, and the rest of us followed, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. It was darker down there, colder, and the air smelled like mildew and something worse, something rotten that I couldn't quite identify. The basement was a maze of narrow hallways and small rooms, most of them completely empty. The walls were bare concrete, unpainted, and the floor was slick with moisture. We walked past rows of empty rooms, most of them stripped of furniture, just dark squares with rusted pipes running along the ceilings. Our flashlights barely seemed to penetrate the darkness, and the shadows moved in ways that made my skin crawl. We were about halfway down one of the longer hallways when we came to a door at the end. It was the only door we'd seen that was closed, a heavy wooden door with a small window at the top that had been painted over. There was something about that door that made me want to turn around and leave, some instinctive warning that we shouldn't open it. But Marcus was already reaching for the handle, and I didn't want to be the one who chickened out. The door opened with a loud creak, and we shone our flashlights inside. What we saw made all of us stop dead. It was a single hospital bed, perfectly made, with clean white sheets and a pillow that looked freshly fluffed. The sheets were crisp and smooth, tucked in with hospital corners, and there wasn't a speck of dust on them. Beside the bed was a wheelchair, old-fashioned but in pristine condition, and on the nightstand was a glass of water that looked fresh, condensation still beating on the outside of the glass. We stood there, staring, and nobody said anything for a long moment. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with bare concrete walls and a single fluorescent light fixture hanging from the ceiling, though the bulb was long gone. But the bed, the wheelchair, the glass of water, they all looked like they'd been placed there yesterday, like someone was staying in this room, like someone was coming back. Jenna was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell?" Marcus stepped into the room, shining his flashlight around, and I could see his hand was shaking slightly. Kyle and I stayed in the doorway, neither of us wanting to go any farther. The air in the room was even colder than the hallway, and there was a smell, faint but distinct, like antiseptic, mixed with something organic and decaying. Marcus reached out and touched the sheets, and then jerked his hand back. "They're damp," he said, his voice tight, like someone just got out of this bed. That's when we heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway behind us. Not running, not hurried, just a steady rhythm of footsteps on concrete, getting closer. We all turned, our flashlights pointed back the way we'd come, but the hallway was empty. Just darkness and the echo of those footsteps, growing louder. We ran. We didn't discuss it, didn't say a word, just turned and ran as fast as we could. Marcus was in front, then Jenna, then me, and Kyle brought up the rear. We could still hear the footsteps behind us, matching our pace, never getting closer but never falling behind either. We ran through the maze of hallways, our flashlights bouncing wildly, until we found the stairwell and took the steps 2 at a time. We burst out into the first-floor lobby, gasping for air, and didn't stop until we were outside, through the gap in the boards, and back at the car. We piled in, Marcus fumbling with the keys, and he finally got the engine started, and we tore out of there, the tires spinning on the gravel. No one said anything for the first few minutes. We just sat there, breathing hard, our hearts pounding. Then Kyle said, "What the fuck was that?" And nobody answered him because none of us knew. We didn't talk about it much after that night. We all tried to laugh it off the next day, saying we'd gotten spooked and imagined the footsteps, that the bed had probably been set up by other explorers as a prank. But I could tell none of us really believed that. The bed had been too perfect, the sheets too clean, and the glass of water, that glass of water, had looked fresh, like it had just been poured. And the footsteps, those slow, deliberate footsteps following us through the dark, had been real. I know they were real. I've thought about that room a lot since then, especially late at night when I can't sleep and my mind wanders to dark places. I think about who made that bed, who left that water, and who was walking toward us in that basement hallway. I've tried to research the hospital, to find out what happened there, why it closed, but there's not much information online. I found a few old newspaper articles about the closure in 1993, vague mentions of budget cuts and safety concerns, but nothing specific. No scandals, no mysterious deaths, nothing that would explain what we saw. But I found forum posts scattered across urban exploration sites and paranormal discussion boards from other people who'd been in that hospital. One guy said he'd found a room in the basement with a perfectly made bed and had heard footsteps following him out. A woman said she'd gone there with friends and they'd seen lights in the basement windows, even though the power had been cut decades ago. Someone else claimed they'd heard voices, conversations in empty rooms, and when they went to investigate, the rooms were empty but still felt occupied, like people had just left. One post really stuck with me. It was from a former employee, someone who'd worked at the hospital in the late 80s, just a few years before it closed. She said there had been a patient ward in the basement, a place where they kept people who couldn't be treated upstairs, people with severe mental illness, people who were violent or catatonic or otherwise too difficult to manage. She said the conditions down there were terrible, that patients were often restrained or sedated heavily, and that more than a few had died in those rooms. She said when the hospital closed, they'd moved most of the patients to other facilities, but there were always rumors that some had been left behind, forgotten in the chaos of the closure. She said she didn't believe the rumors, but she also said she'd never gone back to the hospital after her last shift, and she had nightmares about the basement for years. I don't know if any of that's true. I don't know if the footsteps we heard were from a ghost or a homeless person or just our imaginations running wild. But I know what I saw in that room, and I know how it felt cold and wrong and occupied, like someone was living there, someone who didn't want to be disturbed. And I know that when we ran, those footsteps followed us, never speeding up, never slowing down, just keeping pace like they knew we'd eventually have to stop. Marcus, Jenna, Kyle, and I never went back to that hospital. We graduated high school, went our separate ways, and we don't talk about it now. But every once in a while, I'll see a news story about the hospital, about the city finally deciding to demolish it, or about some teenagers getting arrested for trespassing, and I'll think about that basement room. I'll think about the bed with its clean white sheets, the wheelchair, the glass of water with condensation still beating on the outside. And I'll think about who made that bed, who left that water, and who was walking toward us in the dark. And sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I'll hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway. And I'll tell myself it's just the house settling, just my imagination, just the memory of that night playing tricks on me. But part of me knows better. Part of me knows that whoever was in that basement, whoever made that bed and poured that water, is still there, still waiting. And part of me wonders if they're still following us, even now, years later, still walking those slow, deliberate steps, never speeding up, never falling behind, just keeping pace, waiting for us to stop running. I was camping alone in the Redwood National Forest, doing some solo backpacking to clear my head after a bad breakup. It was one of those situations where you need to get away from everything: the apartment that still smelled like her perfume, the friends who kept asking if I was okay, the city that felt too small and too crowded at the same time. I'd always found peace in the woods, in the quiet and the solitude, so I threw some gear in my car and drove north without much of a plan. I ended up at the Redwood National Forest in late September, when the summer crowds had thinned out and the trails were mostly empty. I parked at one of the trailheads early in the morning and hiked in, following a path that wound through groves of massive redwoods that blocked out most of the sunlight. The trees up there are ancient, some of them over 1,000 years old, and being among them makes you feel small in a way that's almost comforting. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the rustle of wind through the canopy, and after a few hours of walking, I felt some of the tension I'd been carrying start to ease. I set up my tent in a clearing about 2 miles off the main trail, a spot I found by following a deer path that led away from the marked route. The clearing was small, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by thick underbrush and towering redwoods that created a natural barrier. It felt secluded, private, exactly what I was looking for. I spent the afternoon setting up camp, gathering firewood, and just sitting on a fallen log, staring up at the strips of sky visible through the canopy. Everything was peaceful, just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind moving through the branches. I made a simple dinner over a small fire, ate watching the light fade, and then put out the flames and crawled into my tent around 10 p.m. I was exhausted from the hike, and the sleeping bag felt warm and safe after the cold evening air. I fell asleep almost immediately, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep you only get when you're truly tired. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of something breathing outside my tent. It was deep and slow, each breath deliberate and heavy, like a large animal. My first thought was black bears are common in the area, and I'd hung my food in a tree about 50 yards away, but maybe I hadn't done it well enough. But as I lay there, frozen and listening, I realized the breathing was too close. Not just near the tent, but right outside it, maybe 2 feet from where my head was resting against the thin fabric wall. I could hear it moving, the soft crunch of leaves and twigs under its weight, and the breathing continued, steady and rhythmic. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I wanted to reach for my flashlight, to shine it through the tent wall and see what was making the noise, but I couldn't move. Some primal part of my brain was screaming at me to stay perfectly still, to not make a sound, to not let it know I was awake. Then I smelled it, a sharp, rancid smell that hit me like a physical force, seeping through the tent fabric and filling the small space. It was like rotting meat mixed with wet fur, with an underlying musk that was almost sweet in its putridity. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water, and I had to fight the urge to gag. Whatever was outside my tent, it wasn't clean, and it wasn't healthy. It smelled like something that had been dead for days, or something that ate things that had been dead for days. The breathing continued for what felt like forever, circling the tent slowly. I could track its movement by the sound, the way the breathing would fade slightly as it moved toward the back of the tent, then grow louder again as it circled around to the front. It was deliberate, methodical, like it was inspecting the tent, trying to figure out what was inside. And the whole time, that smell hung in the air, thick and nauseating. I don't know how long it lasted. It might have been 10 minutes, it might have been an hour. Time felt strange, stretched out and distorted by fear. But eventually, the breathing stopped. Just stopped, mid-breath, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I waited, listening, every muscle in my body tensed, but I heard nothing. No footsteps walking away, no rustle of underbrush, just complete and total silence. I lay there for the rest of the night, my hand wrapped around the knife I kept in my tent, staring at the dark fabric ceiling and listening to nothing. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I started to relax, I'd hear a sound, a branch snapping, leaves rustling, something that might have been the wind, but might have been something else. The smell lingered for a while, faint but present, and it made my stomach turn every time I caught a whiff of it. When the first light of dawn started to filter through the tent, I finally worked up the courage to unzip the door and look outside. The clearing looked exactly as it had the night before, peaceful, quiet, the morning mist hanging low between the trees. But in the dirt around my tent, I found tracks. Massive, clawed prints pressed deep into the soft earth, each one at least twice the size of my hand. They circled the tent completely, some of them overlapping, like whatever had made them had paced around multiple times. I crouched down to examine them, my hands shaking, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The prints were almost human-shaped, 5 distinct toes, the outline of a heel and ball, but they were too large, too wide, and the claws at the tips of each toe were thick and curved, like something built for digging or tearing. The prints were deep, pressed at least 2 inches into the dirt, which meant whatever had made them was heavy, far heavier than a person. I looked around the clearing, following the tracks, and saw where they came from a gap in the underbrush on the eastern side, and where they went back out the same gap, like whatever it was had approached, circled my tent, and then left the same way it came. I packed up and left immediately. I didn't bother with breakfast, didn't take the time to properly fold my tent or organize my gear. I just shoved everything into my backpack and started hiking as fast as I could, following the deer path back to the main trail, and then practically jogging the 2 miles back to the trailhead. The forest felt different in the daylight, less peaceful and more oppressive, like the trees were closing in around me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something following me, but the trail behind me was always empty. When I got back to my car, I threw my gear in the trunk and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, my hands still shaking, trying to process what had happened. I pulled out my phone and searched for information about animals in the Redwood National Forest, looking for anything that might explain those tracks. Black bears, yes. Mountain lions, occasionally. But neither of those animals had prints that looked anything like what I'd seen. Bear prints are distinctive, 5 toes. Yes, but the shape is different, more rounded, and the claws point forward. Mountain lion prints are feline, 4 toes, no claws visible. What I'd seen didn't match either. I expanded my search, looking at forums and wildlife sites, and eventually I found posts from other hikers who'd had similar experiences in the area. One person described waking up to the sound of breathing outside their tent and finding tracks in the morning that they couldn't identify. Another talked about a smell, rancid and overpowering, that had filled their campsite one night and lingered until morning. A few people mentioned seeing something moving through the trees at dusk, something large and upright, but they dismissed it as a bear standing on its hind legs. But there were other posts too, older ones, references to stories told by the indigenous people who'd lived in the area for thousands of years before settlers arrived. Stories about things that lived deep in the forest, creatures that walked on 2 legs but weren't human, beings that avoided fire and daylight but would approach campers at night, drawn by the smell of food or the presence of people. The descriptions varied, but there was a consistency to them: large, covered in matted fur, with a smell that announced their presence long before they were seen. I'm not saying I believe in Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. I'm a rational person. I work in IT. I believe in science and evidence and explanations that make sense, but I also know what I heard that night, and I know what I smelled, and I know what those tracks look like. And none of it makes sense in the context of the animals that are supposed to be in that forest. I've never gone back to that part of the Redwood National Forest. I still camp, still hike, but I avoid the remote areas, the places where you're miles from the nearest trail and the trees block out the sky. Because I know now that there are things in those forests, things that most people never see, things that stay hidden in the deep woods where the tourists don't go. And I know that whatever was outside my tent that night, it was watching me. It knew I was there, and it circled my tent for reasons I can't begin to understand: curiosity, hunger, territoriality. I don't know. Sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I think about that breathing, deep and slow, so close I could have reached through the tent fabric and touched it. I think about the smell, sharp and rancid, and the way it lingered even after the breathing stopped. And I think about those tracks, pressed deep into the dirt, almost human but not quite. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd made a noise. If I'd reached for my flashlight, if I'd unzipped the tent to look outside, would it have run or would it have stayed? And what would I have seen if I'd looked? I'll never know, and I'm glad I don't. Because I have a feeling that some things are better left unseen, that there are creatures in this world that exist just outside the edge of our understanding, and that encountering them changes you in ways you can't undo. I'm different now than I was before that night. I don't sleep as well. I'm more aware of sounds in the dark, of smells that don't quite fit. And when I'm in the woods, even on a crowded trail in broad daylight, I find myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, listening for the sound of something breathing just out of sight. I don't know what it was, but I know it wasn't a bear, and I know it was watching me. I climbed Mount Shasta with a group of friends one summer, and we camped near the summit to watch the sunrise. It was supposed to be one of those bucket list adventures, the kind of thing you do when you're young and still believe the world is mostly beautiful and conquerable. There were 5 of us: me, my college roommate Ben, his girlfriend Sarah, and 2 guys from our climbing club, Derek and Matt. We'd been planning the trip for months, studying the routes, buying gear, training on smaller peaks in the Sierra Nevada. Mount Shasta is over 14,000 feet, a massive volcanic cone that dominates the Northern California landscape. And it's not a casual hike, but we were prepared, or at least we thought we were. The mountain has a reputation. Even before we started planning the trip, I'd heard stories: strange lights in the sky, hikers who'd gone missing and were never found, tales about underground civilizations living inside the mountain. Mount Shasta attracts a certain type of person, the kind who believes in UFOs and ancient aliens and spiritual vortexes. The town at the base of the mountain is full of crystal shops and New Age bookstores, and you can't walk down the street without someone trying to sell you a guided meditation or a dowsing rod. I didn't believe any of it. I thought it was all tourist trap nonsense, stories made up to sell books and attract visitors, but I should have paid more attention. We started our ascent early in the morning, hiking through forests of pine and fir, before breaking above the tree line into a landscape of volcanic rock and snow. The climb was brutal, steep switchbacks, thin air that made every step feel like you were breathing through a straw, and a sun so bright it hurt even through sunglasses. But by late afternoon, we'd reached a flat area near the summit where we planned to camp. The views were incredible, an endless expanse of mountains and valleys stretching out in every direction, and we set up our tents with a sense of accomplishment, tired but exhilarated. We spent the evening sitting around a small fire we'd built using a portable stove. Open flames aren't allowed on the mountain. But we bent the rules a little, and talking about the day's climb, about our plans for the morning summit push, about nothing in particular. The air was cold and thin, and the sky above us was turning from blue to purple to black, stars appearing one by one until the entire dome of the sky was filled with them. It was beautiful in a way that made you feel small and insignificant, and I remember thinking that this was exactly what I'd needed, a break from the noise and the stress of everyday life. We were sitting around the fire, talking and laughing, when Sarah pointed at the sky. "What is that?" she said, her voice suddenly quiet. We all looked up, following her gaze, and saw them lights moving across the sky in perfect formation. There were maybe 5 or 6 of them, bright points that moved in unison, silent and impossibly fast. They didn't blink like planes, didn't leave contrails, just glided across the darkness like they were on rails. We watched them for a few minutes, mesmerized, none of us saying anything, and then they vanished, just blinked out of existence like someone had flipped a switch. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Ben said, "Satellites, right? Or maybe drones." But his voice was uncertain, and I could tell he didn't believe it any more than I did. Satellites don't move in formation like that, and drones don't just vanish. Derek pulled out his phone to check for planes or military activity in the area, but there was no signal up there, no way to verify anything. We sat there, staring at the sky, waiting for the lights to come back, but they didn't. The sky was empty again, just stars and darkness, and the faint glow of the Milky Way. That's when I heard the voice. It was low and distant, like someone speaking from very far away, and it was calling my name. Not shouting, not urgent, just a calm, clear voice saying, "Alex." I froze, my heart suddenly pounding, and I looked around at the others. They were all staring at me, their faces pale in the firelight. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They nodded, and Sarah said, "It said your name." The voice called again, and this time it sounded closer, like it was coming from just beyond the firelight, somewhere in the darkness surrounding our camp. "Alex." The same tone, the same cadence, clear enough that I knew it was real. I stood up, my legs shaking, and turned in a slow circle, trying to figure out where it was coming from. But the darkness was complete beyond the small pool of light from our fire, and I couldn't see anything. The voice didn't call again, but I could feel something out there, watching us, waiting. None of us slept that night. We sat huddled around the fire, feeding it with fuel from the stove to keep it burning, and we didn't talk much. Every sound made us jump: the wind moving across the rocks, the creak of the tent shifting, the distant rumble of something that might have been rockfall or might have been something else. The voice didn't call again, but the feeling of being watched never went away. It was oppressive, suffocating, like the darkness itself was pressing in on us, and I kept thinking about those lights in the sky, about how they'd moved in formation and then vanished, and about the voice calling my name. As soon as the first light of dawn started to touch the eastern horizon, we packed up. We didn't discuss it, didn't debate whether we should continue to the summit or head back down. We just started breaking down the tents, stuffing gear into backpacks, moving quickly and quietly, like we were afraid something might notice if we made too much noise. The climb down was faster than the climb up, driven by adrenaline and the overwhelming need to get off that mountain. We barely spoke, just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, and by midday we were back at the trailhead, loading our gear into the car. The drive back was silent. None of us wanted to talk about what we'd seen and heard, like saying it out loud would make it more real. We dropped Derek and Matt off at their apartment, said awkward goodbyes, and then Ben drove Sarah and me back to our place. He and Sarah left the next morning, heading back to their hometown, and we haven't talked about that night since. It's like we all made an unspoken agreement to forget it happened, to pretend it was just a weird experience brought on by altitude sickness or exhaustion, or too much time staring at the stars. But I couldn't forget. I kept thinking about the voice, about how it had known my name, about how my friends had heard it too. And I kept thinking about those lights, moving in perfect formation across the sky. A few days after we got back, I started researching Mount Shasta, looking for anything that might explain what we'd experienced. And I found dozens of stories, hundreds maybe, scattered across forums and blogs and old newspaper archives. Stories just like ours, lights in the sky, voices calling from the darkness, people who felt like they were being watched or followed. There were accounts from hikers who'd seen strange lights hovering near the summit, lights that moved in ways that defied physics, accelerating and stopping instantly, making sharp turns at impossible angles. There were stories from climbers who'd heard voices calling their names, voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Some people reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread near the summit, a feeling so strong they turned back even though they were close to reaching the top. Others talked about missing time, about starting a climb and arriving back at the trailhead hours later than they should have, with gaps in their memory they couldn't explain. The indigenous people of the area, the Wintu and the Shasta, have their own stories about the mountain. They consider it sacred, a place of power, where the physical and spiritual worlds overlap. There are legends about beings that live inside the mountain, tall figures with pale skin who occasionally emerge to observe the human world before disappearing back underground. Some of the stories talk about lights in the sky, spirit beings that travel between the mountain and the stars, and about voices that call to people, drawing them deeper into the wilderness where they're never seen again. I found accounts from the early 1900s, newspaper articles about hikers who'd gone missing on Mount Shasta under mysterious circumstances. One article from 1909 described a solo climber who'd left camp to summit alone and never returned. Search parties found his gear scattered across the rocks near the summit, but his body was never recovered. Another article from the 1950s told the story of a group of climbers who'd reported seeing a craft hovering near the peak, a metallic disc that reflected the sunlight before shooting straight up into the sky and vanishing. The climbers were interviewed by local authorities, and all of them told the same story, describing the object in identical terms. There were more recent stories, too, accounts from the last few decades. A woman who'd camped near the summit in the 1990s said she'd woken in the middle of the night to find her tent surrounded by tall, pale figures that stood perfectly still, watching her. She'd screamed, and they'd vanished, but in the morning she'd found footprints around her tent, large, humanoid prints that didn't match any known animal. A man who'd climbed the mountain in 2010 said he'd heard a voice calling his name repeatedly throughout the night, and when he'd followed it into the darkness, he'd found himself standing at the edge of a cliff, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. The more I read, the more unsettled I became, because all of these stories had the same elements: lights in the sky, voices in the darkness, a feeling of being watched, and they all took place on Mount Shasta, this massive volcanic peak that seems to attract strangeness the way a magnet attracts metal. I started to wonder if there was something about the mountain itself, something in its geology or its electromagnetic field, that caused hallucinations or altered states of consciousness. But that didn't explain how 5 of us had all seen and heard the same things, or how so many people over so many years had reported nearly identical experiences. I'll never go back to Mount Shasta. The memory of that night is too vivid, too unsettling. I still hear the voice sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, a low, distant sound calling my name. It's faint, barely audible, but it's there, and every time I hear it, I feel a cold spike of fear run through me, because I know it's not my imagination. I know that voice was real, and I know that whatever was out there in the darkness near the summit, it knew who I was. I don't know what's up there on Mount Shasta. I don't know if it's extraterrestrial or interdimensional or something even stranger, something that's been there long before humans started climbing that mountain. But I know that it's watching, and I know that it calls to people, draws them in with lights and voices and a curiosity that's almost impossible to resist. And I know that some people who answer that call don't come back. They vanish into the wilderness, their gear scattered, their bodies never found, and they become another story, another mystery, another name added to the long list of people who went to Mount Shasta and never came home.